when he came to America, davened at the Garish Stiebel on the west side with Professor Heschel. They were in the same minyan. I don't think they ever spoke about anything, but so it's he was not that long ago. So please, without further ado,
thank you. So thank you for having me, Rabbi Wilkenfeld. And let me just begin by saying the expertise is as a teacher, not as a scholar on Heschel. So I'm going to share a love and appreciation for Heschel and a lot of learning that and also a lot of experience teaching Heschel. And I think it's interesting to approach Heschel this way because there's a conversation about Abraham Joshua Heschel. I'll say more about who Heschel was and set him up a little bit more. But there's a conversation about Heschel, which is how to think about him. He's famous as a theologian, as a thinker, as an activist, a social activist, a rabbi, a professor, involved in interfaith work, broad array of activities. And there are those who want to kind of contemplate whether or not we can characterize Heschel as a prophet. Did he think himself a prophet? Was he a prophet? And there's some interesting conversations around that. We can come back to that. But the description of Heschel that I think resonates with me best is a description of him as a teacher. I mean, he's an activist. He certainly has prophet-like qualities, but I really think he's a teacher at the heart of it, a religious teacher. And so in some ways I'm incredibly, as a teacher myself, incredibly sympathetic to that dimension of Heschel's work, because I think the question that Heschel faced in the 20th century, he was born in 1907, died in 1973, is that right? 72. By the way, that's 1907 and not 1909 on the page. As one of the towering figures in American Jewish activism thought, religious thought, he was facing the question how to bring people to God, how to bring God to people. So it's an educational question. It's really first and foremost an educational question, right? He was not interested in proofs, in arguments, in postulates, in philosophic systems. He was interested in moving people to God and making space for God in the world. And as a teacher, to some extent, I mean, that's what we do, right? As educators, as rabbis, that's what we do. So I think what I'd like to do is kind of frame the conversation, frame the texts with that in mind, that's Heschel's project. And so I tried to select texts that could give you a sense, a feel of really an enormous oeuvre, an enormous amount of work, give you a feel for the kind of writing and the kind of, and Heschel's voice and Heschel's concerns, and then kind of just raise the question with you about, method and does it work and does it move and is it effective? So that's by way of introducing one very, very central dimension of him. Heschel was born in Poland, grew up in Warsaw, educated in traditional Jewish schooling, Hasidic dynasties, both in his mother's side and his father's side. 6 generations of the Apter Reb, in the Hasidic dynasty of the Apter Hasidism. Was a prodigy, spiritually, religiously gifted. Was clearly going to be the next, or seemingly going to be the next Hasidic Rebbe in his dynasty, but he wanted something different. He had a curiosity, had an interest, and I believe around age 16 went to Berlin and became ordained in the modern Orthodox school in rabbinical school in Germany, and also entered the University of Berlin and got his doctorate in 1933. He wrote on the prophets, he wrote on prophetic consciousness for his doctorate, and also published before his doctorate, his first published work was a work of poetry, which we'll come back to, and was just recently translated. We'll come back to the poetry in a moment. Started working in education, was working at the Lehrhaus, at Martin Buber's Lehrhaus, doing adult education in Germany, and in 1938 was deported. Was sent back to Poland, and 6 weeks before the invasion, the German Nazi invasion of Poland, he got out and was able to get to England, and then I believe in 43 came to the States. I don't remember exactly the date. I think 43 came to the States. His family's wiped out. His father died before the war. Mother died in bombing. 2 sisters killed in concentration camps. I mean, saw himself as, Udmutsameh, saw himself really as plucked from the flames. Ended up getting out by way of employment at HUC, Hebrew Union College. So the scion of this Hasidic family teaching at the Center of Reform Judaism in America in Cincinnati. And he taught there for 5 years. And so the story goes, and I think there's some credibility to it, that there was discomfort with the perspective on biblical criticism and biblical scholarship at the Reform Seminary. And so he found his way to JTS, Jewish Theological Seminary, in the late 40s, and spent the rest of his professional career there. Of course, his taught mysticism, taught Jewish ethics at JTS, but really became known, for his activism, for his marching with Dr. Martin Luther King in Selma, for his protesting Vietnam, for his interfaith work. He ended up at the Second Vatican Council, apparently was influential in helping to universalize some of the sentiments of that Catholic effort, and really became the face of, the Jewish face of Judaism for the non-Jewish world. So I want to pause there for a minute. I know this both from my own educational experiences and both, so I know this anecdotally. So I'm going to put out the question here, and people who are raised in Orthodox worlds or Orthodox educational institutions, did you study Heschel?
No.
Okay. So that confirms my suspicions, although I'm also interested in the generational aspect of this. Anyone know if any what world of current educational orthodoxy or Orthodox institutions are studying Heschel?
Five, 10 years ago, I heard of Benny Lau speak very positively about turning a Shemayim, and about some students at Beit who were reading Heschel, kind of importing him into the Israeli Datzini world. So I think that conversation is happening.
It's beginning, yeah.
I think the sound of that sort of stuff, considered safe.
Yeah. Well, so I think so. The question of safe is really an interesting question, right? So having not grown up in Orthodox, well, I guess I did kind of grow up in Orthodox educational institutions. I went to SAR, I went to Ramaz, but so that counts. I think that counts. Funny that I don't think of that as as we certainly did not study Heschel. But our son, who was at Malay Gilboa, at the Yeshiva Malay Gilboa in Israel, makes this big point of the ways in which they have, all kinds of learning and books in their library, right? Not just Jewish books. And I do think that kind of in a way Heschel counts as one of those, look, we have Heschel. And so I was doing some Googling to sort of see what I could see just, to confirm both anecdotes and impressions. And I literally Googled, I don't know, what do Orthodox people think about Heschel or something like that. And I got some sort of blog that asked the question, is Heschel kosher? And there were a series of responses, and it was fascinating. It was actually fascinating to see what the problems are with Heschel. And so there's a famous interview that some of you may have seen with Carl Stern that happened days before Heschel's death, right? You can still see it. You can get it on YouTube. There's 4 segments. It's unbelievable. I mean, you want to imagine Heschel as a prophet. I mean, it's an unbelievable thing to listen to. So on this blog exchange, the person said, in that interview, his kippah falls off, and he doesn't pick it up. Basically, need I say more? It was indicative of all the suspicions, around Heschel. And there was definitely back and forth. There was definitely multiple positions. There were those who say he's kosher, those who say he's not kosher. So I thought it suggested, what I think is really interesting to think about. What is it about Heschel that seems challenging and difficult? And so we're going to get into that also. And I think, Rabbi Wilkenfeld, you're right. I think Heschel's actually not just making its way into the Israeli Dati conversation, but it's actually making its way into the Israeli landscape now. So Heschel's is being translated into Hebrew and becoming more well known in Israel too. It's also just interesting to think about just the cultural presumptions and where people become popular. I mean, so in this room, people weren't raised on it. But do people here feel familiar with Heschel? Just show of hands, feel familiar? So then at some point, you become interested and you start reading. Okay, so now let me ask you another question. If you had one wish, that's it, what would it be? One wish, think hard, make it a good one, what would it be? Let's pause, come up with it.
The Cubs might win again.
What? The Cubs might win again. Did you wish for the Cubs winning?
No, are you limiting our wishes to Judaism?
No, life. So you don't have to share your wish unless you wish to. I'd love to know people's wishes. But Heschel had one wish, so he says, or so Sam Dresner says, one of his students, in the anthology that he then subsequently put together called I Asked for Wonder. And the introduction to that anthology, which is really like snippets of Heschel greats, which we can say more about also, he tells the story where he's visiting Heschel, really on his deathbed. And Sam Dresner, Rabbi Dresner, alav shalom, is devastated and sad because this is a sudden kind of onset illness, and Heschel's not. Heschel's feeling peaceful and accepting and grateful. And Rabbi Dresner asks Heschel about it, and he said, Sam, I asked for one thing. I asked for wonder, and I got it. And so death is a homecoming. I'm going home. And then there's more, and you can open up the spiritual anthology, I Ask for Wonder, and see it. But that says a lot about Abraham Joshua Heschel. I asked for wonder. Wonder is Heschel's one wish, and it's what he wishes for all of us, and what he thinks we're all capable of. And by we, I mean Jew and non-Jew, humans. So I think we have to think about what is it about wonder that is so important, what is it about wonder that orients you to life such that death is a homecoming. And it's also worth pausing over our own wishes, right? I mean, leave it to Heschel to actually have one request, right? I mean, and come up with a good one. But so I want to open that up. Like, what do you think? What do you think it is about wonder that makes that the thing to ask for?
I would ask for understanding.
You would ask for understanding.
Yeah.
You would ask for understanding. Why? Why would you ask for understanding?
Because that's what I lack.
Such humility. Mel would ask for understanding. So why wonder?
He's a chassid. When you asked about yeshivas, he wouldn't be in our yeshiva because he was a chassid. You wouldn't consider him.
You wouldn't read him.
No.
You wouldn't? In his yeshiva, they wouldn't have read Heschel because he was a chassid. So what?
So wonder's dynamic, and it suggests a constant ability to see possibilities and openness so that the world keeps changing and grows with you, so you never stop growing. So wonder to me is very attached to growth.
Beautiful, beautiful. Heschel says that. Wonder keeps you open. It opens you. And actually, he distinguishes between wonder and curiosity. Right? Curiosity can be satisfied. Wonder, and Heschel articulates wonder as a way of thinking, an orientation in the world. And it's ever renewing, ever open, exactly as you're saying. Exactly as you're saying. Anything else about wonder?
It takes you outside yourself. You can never conquer it. The world fills you with this feeling, and it can't be controlled or scrutinized or contained.
Fantastic. So that is another key piece here that we're going to get to. The one key way to understand, one way into Heschel is to think about wonder. Another key way into Heschel is to think about self-transcendence. This is from Shai Held. Shai Held's recent book on Heschel called The Call of Transcendence. And really what wonder gets you is transcending the self. And transcending the self is the key move to make space for God. So we have to, and if you're hearing, Kabbalistic undercurrents and Hasidic undercurrents in terms of tzimtzum, in terms of constriction, in terms of self-limiting, and we'll talk more about self-limiting God, right? So self-transcendence, openness. Paul?
I've been thinking about the distinction between wonder and another word that he uses all the time, which is awe. And the thing that was occurring to me is that wonder, there's an intimacy to wonder, as opposed to the transcendence and the over-againstness of awe and amazement. But wonder retains the kind of intimate relationship quality to the relationship to God.
Nice. I think people are, and Shai Held does a beautiful job of this, and others do too. I mean, there's ways to kind of distinguish in Heschel's writing between wonder and awe and radical amazement. And what Heschel seems to be saying is that wonder leads to awe. Wonder leads to awe. And when you get to awe, you have insight. It's not a feeling, it's understanding. It's a response, and again, a way in the world that is it's a response, and it shows understanding, it shows insight. Radical amazement, we'll look at a text in a moment. Radical amazement, and I'm sure you've heard these Heschel terms. Radical amazement is the sense, it's a much more macro sense of observing that there's any observing going on at all. Look at me observing. Look at me wondering. Look at me, look at the fact that there's a me. Right? It's that meta process where you're just amazed that there's any fact at all. So it's a very, very, it's the broadest sense. Wonder is the beginning. Wonder is the beginning of it for Heschel, and he thinks we have a preconscious and preconceptual intuition for God, intuition that gets expressed in wonder, and eventually we put language to it, but that preconscious and preconceptual thing we're born with. And that ability, that intuition, that ability to wonder, he actually sees that as the way that we all know that we're responding to something real because of our response in wonder, in awe, in radical amazement. There's something real that we are responding to. It is being provoked, and we are responding, and our capacity to do that is what has us, from Heschel's perspective, certain that this is outside of us, not only in our imagination. There was a hand, or yeah, and anyone.
I'm wondering why wonder.
I'm curious.
The wish part, you wish upon something, it's something that you don't have. And I'm just curious, wonder, as you just said, so intuitive, it's so elementary. You walk around the world, you can't be astonished by certain
Wow.
things.
Wow.
Why would I wish to have something that's so innate? I would want a broader sense of comprehension, for example, because my wonder can't be dealt with because sometimes things are just too vast. So I wish for greater comprehension. So why wonder?
It's a perfect question. Heschel thinks the sin of modernity is callousness. So it's interesting. I wonder what you think about humans in this world today. Do you think humans walk around with wonder? Heschel thought in his day that the sin, our cardinal sin, is callousness. And that his project as an educator, as a teacher, as a spiritual mentor was to provoke the wonder that's within us, to kind of release the wonder. And he thinks religion, he says this about religion, religions are legacies of wonder. Religions are legacies of wonder. Religions emerge because we need to channel our wonder. We need to do something with it. So religions emerge, and then subsequent generations can tap into that legacy and reawaken that intuition, or that gets deadened. That gets deadened in a world of expediency, a world of acquisition, a world of busyness, a world where curiosity is about acquiring and knowing, as opposed to apprehending and responding and appreciating. So it's interesting that your own experience is one where you think wonder is such a given. For Heschel's perspective, that was not the case. Now, again, on this point, he's drawing upon his own experiences in the world. He's drawing upon his own observations in the world. And one of the critiques of Heschel is that he's generalizing from his own experience. Of course, he's a great reader of Judaism and a great reader of our texts. But at the end of the day, because he's not making philosophic arguments, he's describing and using poetic language to provoke this within you, so that your assent to it is, yes, I see that too. Yes, that's my own experience too. But it's right off the bat, you're saying, it's interesting, that's actually not my experience. My experience isn't that wonder is so difficult to come to. My experience is that wonder is right there. I'd ask for something bigger. For him, that's the key to it all. That's the key to it all. If you can walk in the world with wonder, then the self-transcendence and God coming into our lives, that's really the package. That's really it. The rest now flows from that. Those are the three important things to think about for Heschel. Wonder, self-transcendence, and God needs man. God needs man. Vinny, did you want to comment before?
Oh, I was going to ask the same question.
Oh.
I was also thinking that wonder is inherently positive and optimistic as well. And if you like now that you said that Heschel's the main thing that he sees as negative in the world is callousness, wonder is in many ways not just the opposite of that, because it's reverting the callousness, it's also a positive channeling of a positive aspect of a person's intuition or self that is not it's not only on the other side of callousness, it suppresses the callousness because it's positive.
Nice.
Is wonder a means or an end, according to Heschel?
It's a means. It's a means. It's a way in the world. It's an orientation in the world. It's a way of thinking. He calls it a way of thinking. It's a way towards God. It's a way towards, bringing God into this world.
If wonder is a means, what's the end?
The end is returning home.
I would say it's understanding.
Not for Heschel. Not for Heschel.
Sure.
Not for Heschel. Let's talk more about this in a moment. I want to say one more thing about, when you hear the word wonder, does that strike you as childlike? As a childlike, just, right? So conversations around Heschel also become interesting, because I think that's also the point, that this is the things these are innate. This is innate. Every child has it. What happens to us as we grow old is we lose it. We become calloused. right? So he's trying to tap into this childlike reality that we as adults need to maintain, and or return to, or resuscitate, or whatever language you want to use. Okay, let's begin to look at some of Heschel's language. So these are the first couple are just to give you, I think to say this in Heschel's, to say what we've been saying in Heschel's language. Living is not a private affair of the individual. Living is what man does with God's time, what man does with God's world. How should I live the life that I am? To be is to stand for. So this next text I brought to emphasize this part of Heschel, this educator part of Heschel. Everything depends on the person who stands in front of the classroom. The teacher is not an automatic fountain from which intellectual beverages may be obtained. He is either a witness or a stranger. To guide a pupil into the promised land, he must have been there himself. When asking himself, do I stand for what I teach? Do I believe what I say? He must be able to answer in the affirmative. What we need more than anything else is not textbooks, but text people. It is the personality of the teacher, which is the text that the pupils read, the text that they will never forget. This is who's heard this quote before? This is like famous. This is a lot of like famous Heschel sentiments and sensibilities and language. And this is famous. Teachers are. We need text people, not textbooks.
Just a quick reminder as we read his words that this is his fourth or fifth language.
Yes.
That he starts in Yiddish,
Yes.
he knows German, he knows Hebrew,
Polish, yep.
and he only learns English as an adult.
Beautiful.
And it's the most stunning language you'll ever run into.
Beautiful. And how would you characterize this language? What kind of writing does he do?
It sparkles. I mean, it's wonderful.
Beautiful, beautiful. It's poetic. He writes theology and poetry, and the way he described his own theological thinking was depth. His own theological project was as depth theology. He says his project is to reach into the depths of you, the listener and the reader, and bring it out. Depth theology. Another way it's been described as poetic theology, that he wants in poetry to kind of do this, right? Do this. He wants to reach you this way. He wants to reach you in person, and he wants to reach you through poetic language. His people have also debated whether he's, the poet. Philosophical types have critiqued Heschel for not being systematic. And the response by the scholars, and I agree with this response, the ones I've read, and Shai Held including, is that his poetry is a method. It's a deliberate method. It's not that he couldn't do philosophy. He didn't want to do systematic philosophy. He wanted to write poetic thinking to inspire you to be alive and see yourself as on God's time. So the question is, does it work? So this is his biographical sketch of himself in his experience at the University of Berlin. I came with great hunger to the University of Berlin to study philosophy. I looked for a system of thought, for the depth of the spirit, for the meaning of existence. Erudite and profound scholars gave courses in logic, epistemology, aesthetics, ethics, and metaphysics. They opened the gates of the history of philosophy. Yet, in spite of the intellectual power and honesty with which I was privileged to witness, I became increasingly aware of the gulf that separated my views from those held at the university. I had come with a sense of anxiety. How can I rationally find a way where ultimate meaning lies, a way of living where one would never miss a reference to supreme significance? He wanted to find a way of living where one would never miss a reference to supreme significance. That's the project. For him, and he says this in many places, the world is an illusion. It alludes to meaning more significant than itself. It points to. We'll come back to that. Why am I here at all, and what is my purpose? I did not even know how to phrase my concern, but to my teachers, that was a question unworthy of philosophical analysis. I realized that my teachers were prisoners of a Greek-German way of thinking. My assumption was man's dignity consists in his having been created in the likeness of God. My question was, how must man, a being who is in essence the image of God, think, feel, and act? Not a philosophical question, right? It's a very Jewish question. How must a being who is created in the image of God feel, think, and act? That's what I want to know. To them, religion was a feeling. To me, religion included the insights of Torah, which is a vision of man from the point of view of God. They spoke of God from the point of view of man. To them, God was an idea, a postulate of reason. They granted him the status of being a logical possibility, but to assume that he had existence would have been a crime against epistemology. How do you know? You can't prove what you know? It's a crime against epistemology. In those months in Berlin, I went through moments of profound bitterness. I felt very much alone with my own problems and anxieties. I walked alone in the evenings through the magnificent streets of Berlin. I admired the solidity of its architecture, the overwhelming drive and power of a dynamic civilization. There were concerts, theaters, and inventions, and I was pondering whether to go to the new Max Reinhardt play or to a lecture about the theory of relativity. Suddenly I noticed the sun had gone down. Evening had arrived. From what time may one recite the Shema in the evening? I had forgotten God. I had forgotten Sinai. I had forgotten that sunset is my business, that my task is to restore the world to the kingship of the Lord. So I began to utter the words of the evening prayer, "Blessed art thou, Lord our God, King of the universe, who by his word brings on the evenings." I just want to pause over sunsets are my business. I just want to pause over that, but yes.
It's such an interesting contrast to a famous passage that we'll see next week in the Beit man, where he talks about Isha Halakha sees the sunset and then thinks immediately of the halachic categories that that sunset means now new obligations occur and this is similar in the way he sees the sunset, and it's not an aesthetic experience. It reminds him of Sinai and the obligation, but it's a emotional, prayerful experience as opposed to halachic man who it's a cognitive experience of imposing these halachic categories on nature. In this passage, Heschel is nature is inspiring him to turn towards God emotionally. It's a very interesting, similar moment, similar that phenomenon, but it's a very different. Parallel religious journeys.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I'm sure it's a world of difference, but the sunset called him to prayer.
Yeah. Right.
It called him to action.
Yeah.
And it's actually it's very important that it called him to action. Prayer is the heart of it for Heschel. For Heschel, prayer is the heart of it, but Heschel is famous for his March on Selma saying, I'm praying with my feet. And people misunderstood that to mean that social justice is the new form of prayer. That's not what Heschel meant. All mitzvot, all actions are a form of prayer, because what prayer fundamentally does is make space for God. So in turning to a fellow man out of ethical concern, or in marching with Dr. Martin Luther King, you're making space for God. In turning to God, praying, over the sunset, or in turning to man, marching, in Selma, you are making space for God. And in that sense, prayer is a feature of the ethical behaviors as much as the ritual behaviors. And I think it's very interesting that what Heschel does here is he takes the Kabbalistic brilliance to see ritual behaviors as affecting God, returning God to God's perfection and wholeness, and Heschel expands the canvas. He now says we have ethical behaviors also, mitzvot ben adam l'chavero, that also return us to God and bring God down to us. But it's so that's a bit of a tangent, but I want to make the point that I got to stop and pray. So it's an action. And then, of course, what the ritualization and the routinization, what keva does, and essentially you could read Heschel as going between keva and kavanah, right? You could basically read Heschel as playing that traditional dynamic between routine and spontaneity. Routine and spontaneity. Spontaneity is the goal, routine is the way. That's Heschel's language. It's very traditional, right? He thinks, and this is also Heschel's language, there should be no spiritual plagiarism. If we are only echoing tradition and doing routine without spiritual kavanah, without the intensity, without the spirituality, then spirituality is not his word actually. Then it's not going to do what it needs to do, right? It's not going to bring us where we need to be, because routine alone will not provoke wonder. But without routine, you will forget your sunsets. You will forget your sunsets. And what happens when you're in Berlin and you forget your sunsets? Why do we have to pay attention to sunsets? They happen without our paying attention to it, don't they? Why do we have to pay attention? I mean, right? So this is Heschel. We have to pay attention because the sunset alludes to something beyond itself. It's a gift. It's a gift.
No, I was just thinking that, but you just said it, that repetition, I mean, there are two sort of diametrically opposite ways of looking at this. One, the sense that repetition of mitzvot or ritual or whatever will ultimately lead you to a sense of kavanah, of greater appreciation. And he is just the opposite. I mean, that's not, I like the term of plagiarizing tradition, but that's not going to get you.
Yeah.
That's not going to get you there.
Right. He thinks religion is a means to getting you there. He does. But it has to be done, religion can be abused. Religion can be, given over to bad ends, taken over by, people who want to put it to bad ends. So religion has the potential to get us there. And he thinks we need to have the routine. We can't leave it. This is not happenstance. This isn't like once in a while I'll be inspired. I'll happen upon, I'm going on a hike in the summer and that's my moment. No. This is daily. Because wonder has to be perpetual. Because without it, we can't transcend ourselves. Ego will take over. And the modern condition will be what the modern condition is. Let's see what the modern condition is. Yes?
I'm a little confused by this biography. Like, is someone that left what I would imagine is more of a God-oriented community to go to the University of Berlin and sort of stayed in that culture and civilization. It seems like he's seeing that as like an imposition, his ability to live as a Jew, discover spirituality in the world. Even what could be for a civilized man, like very inspiring, like Max Reinhardt's playing or listening to Theory of Relativity, is saying that's like distracting him from his religious life.
Yeah. I mean, it has the potential. It has the potential to distract. He thinks the world of Greek thought and the world of modern German thought they were operating. He often distinguishes between the world of wonder and the world of expediency. An instrumentalist world of acquisition, of convenience, of logic, of reason, of systems, and he chose, as you say, absolutely rightly. He lives within the world of integration rather than the world of segregation. He saw his project as bringing God to us, not bringing God to his Hasidic community. Maybe because his Hasidic community didn't need it. I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't know maybe, I don't know. I haven't read anything where I saw that sort of self-analysis or reflection, but.
Well, I would just argue that he was almost homeless. He wasn't comfortable completely in the Hasidic world that he left, but he also never became comfortable in this world of the philosophers of Berlin. He was always in this you said, trying to balance Keva and Kavanah, he was just in this kind of middle ground. And I think that was just a struggle throughout his life.
Yeah. I don't know. Again, like not being a scholar in Heschel, I'm certainly not the definitive one to answer that question. He was uprooted and saw himself as uprooted. But I don't know how much pain he experienced living in the world he lived. I mean, there was the pain of the devastation of his entire family, the destruction of European Jewry, right? I mean, he said he never went back to Poland, never went back to Germany. I mean, he said to go back there is to see, to imagine the horrors, right? Right. I mean, he's, but I don't know. Again, maybe people have read things that I'm not thinking about. But in all that I've read of Heschel, I haven't seen him bemoan his sort of homelessness. I actually think he, and he says, so let's keep reading. Let's keep reading because there's something about how people are responding. So let's read the next text, 6 on page 2. As civilization advances, the sense of wonder declines. Such decline is an alarming symptom of our state of mind. Mankind will not perish for want of information, but only for want of appreciation. The beginning of our happiness lies in the understanding that life without wonder is not worth living. What we lack is not a will to believe, but a will to wonder. Awareness of the divine begins with wonder. It is the result of what man does with his higher incomprehension. He wants us not to comprehend. But by the way, he's not anti-intellectual or anti-science at all. He just sees science and knowledge extends wonder. The more you know, the more appreciation you have. So don't read him as anti-intellectual, but we have a certain amount of maladjustment and lack of comprehension that's important, and we can say more about that. Awareness of the divine begins with wonder. It is the result of what man does with his higher incomprehension. The greatest hindrance to such awareness is our adjustment to conventional notions, to mental cliches. Wonder, or radical amazement, the state of maladjustment to words and notions, is therefore a prerequisite for an authentic awareness of that which is. What?
Wonder is a prerequisite.
Yeah. It's the necessary condition in order to apprehend what actually is. Radical amazement has a wider scope than any other act of man. While any act of perception or cognition has as its object a select segment of reality, radical amazement refers to all reality, not only to what we see, but also to the very act of seeing, as well as to our own selves, to the selves that see and are amazed at their ability to see. Again, probably you could pause for a moment here and just say, Mommy, why do we see? And of course, like, if you just think through that very childlike question, what really is the answer to that question? Science has an explanation, and Heschel's all for that scientific explanation, but it depends how far you want to keep going, right? And that's his point about wonder, that it doesn't end with the scientific explanation. The scientific explanation just extends the wonder. The more you know, the more you're like, wow, incredible, I can't believe we can see. Right? Anyone, doctors of eyes, know how complex it is, right? I mean, then you're just like, wow, it's unbelievable. The grandeur or mystery of being is not a particular puzzle to the mind, as, for example, the cause of volcanic eruptions. We do not have to go to the end of reasoning to encounter it. Grandeur or mystery is something with which we are confronted everywhere at all times. Even the very act of thinking baffles our thinking, just as every intelligible fact is, by virtue of being a fact, drunk with baffling aloofness. Does not mystery reign within reasoning, within perception, within explanation? What formula could explain and solve the enigma of the very fact of thinking? What fills us with radical amazement is the fact that even the minimum of perception is a maximum of enigma. Another famous Heschel line. So this is modern man, text 7. After having eaten the forbidden fruit, the Lord sent forth man from paradise to till the ground from which he was taken. But man, who is more subtle than any other creature that God has made, what did he do? He undertook to build a paradise by his own might, and he is driving God from his paradise. For generations, all looked well, but now we have discovered that our paradise is built upon the top of a volcano. The paradise we have built may turn out to be a vast camp for the extermination of man. This is a time to cry out. One is ashamed to be human. One is embarrassed to be called religious in the face of religion's failure to keep alive the image of God in the face of man. We see the writing on the wall, but are too illiterate to understand what it says. There are no easy solutions to grave problems. All we can honestly preach is a theology of dismay. We have imprisoned God in our temples and slogans, and now the word of God is dying on our lips. We have ceased to be symbols. By the way, who's doing the preaching? Religion. Right? Priests, rabbis, religious teachers. Right? In other words, religion is also part of the problem here, right? Not just part of the solution. What is history? Wars, victories, and wars. So many dead, so many tears, so little regret, so many fears. And who could sit in judgment over the victims of cruelty whose horror turns to hatred? Is it easy to keep the horror of wickedness from turning into a hatred of the wicked? The world is drenched in blood, and the guilt is endless. Should not all hope be abandoned? What saved the prophets from despair was their messianic vision and the idea of man's capacity for repentance or turning to God. That vision and the idea affected their understanding of history. History is not a blind alley, and guilt is not an abyss. There's always a way that leads out of guilt. Repentance or turning to God, the prophet is a person who, living in dismay, has the power to transcend his dismay. Over all the darkness of experience hovers the vision of a different day. Our God is also the God of our enemies. Without their knowing him and despite their defying him, the enmity between the nations will turn to friendship. They will live together when they will worship together. All three will be equally God's chosen people.
All three.
All three.
What three?
Western religions. He's talking about Islam and Christianity there. So, I don't know if you share Heschel's vision of the world, but it was not rose-colored glasses, right? I mean, he saw the darkness. He was at the heart of the darkness. And so I don't know. I think he's trying to offer a theology of hope and not a theology of dismay. And he thinks that the way to it is to return humans to what their potential is. Their potential to live in the world appreciating sunsets, right? Appreciating that they're appreciating that they're thinking, appreciating that they're reasoning, right? Appreciating that they're seeing. He's trying to provoke that and trying to provoke our response. Just watch the time. Okay, I think I have 5 more minutes. So I want to say something about, and you can see on page 4 some text about prayer, where the focus of prayer is not the self, prayer comes to pass, so that's a text 11. We can take a look at some of those texts on your own. There's a beautiful, beautiful way he characterizes man, which I love, in text 12 and 13. It is the task of man to reveal what is concealed, to be the voice of glory, to sing its silence. It is our task to sing its silence, to utter, so to speak, what is in the heart of all things. The glory is here, invisible and silent. Man is the voice. His task is to be the song. In singing, we perceive what is otherwise beyond perceiving. Why song? I think Ellie could speak to that. Because he's a chassid, is that? Pshita, it's obvious. Obvious, it's song. So why song? Why song? And then, of course, think about why Heschel writes poetry also, right?
It comes from the Kishkas. It's a song that music to bring out the emotional response.
Okay, great. Pathos comes from the Kishkis.
It can combine between music and lyrics. It can combine the emotional and spiritual with the intellectual.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yes.
Well, I mean, I think there's a whole German philosophical
Yeah.
approach, starting with Schopenhauer, that says that music and song is pure spirit, not in a way that words can never be.
Yeah.
And maybe sort of alluding
Yeah.
to that notion that
Good.
melody and sound goes straight in, has a kind of ethereal, kind of directly spiritual thing.
I'm sure he is within that tradition also. I want to look at, yes, Mel?
Read 13.
Yeah, I want to read that text. Thank you. That's the text I wanted to read. And then I want to get back to words and song. There are 3 ascending levels, this is 13, of how one mourns. With tears, that's the lowest. With silence, that is higher. And with song. Wow. So I think song brings us to, is a way for us to think about his relationship to words, how he wrote poetically, and why when you read his work, it's midrashic. It's a plethora of words. It's a constant multiplying of words. Even in the small little passages we read, he keeps playing with the same sentiment, articulating it a little bit differently. It's midrashic. He writes like a midrashist. You read, in so many of his works, he's invested in Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael, in the Baal Shem Tov, and in the Kotzker Rebbe. He's not just interested in painting the portrait of a single voice, he's interested always, it seems to me, in painting multiple voices. And it's not just like the fact that he's mimicking tradition. There's a wisdom in tradition that I think he is onto, and he says this, I'm not inferring this. It has to do with revelation, and how revelation is a mystery. It is an event. Sinai was an event. And all language in relationship to that event, all language is inadequate to the task. Revelation in its realm of the mysterious, all language can't adequately convey it. So rather than limit language to 1 or 2 postulates or 1 or 2 ways of articulating it, we do multiple ways of articulating it so that we can demonstrate, in a way, the limits of language. Right? You can go Rambam and do no language, or you can go Midrash and do multiple language. And Heschel is sympathetic to Rambam's impulse, but maybe you would just say he's a chassid, so he can't. But maybe that brings us where song comes in. Right? Where song really is wordless, and in some ways is the highest rung. And if it's the highest rung on how you respond when there's mourning, kal v'chomer, right? All the more so when there's celebration, right? It's the way you respond to the world. You respond in song, and the ideal response, in a way, is wordless. Right? And in some ways, all of our efforts to bring words to it. It's possible that because of some of his stuff on Revelation, his famous line that as an account on Revelation, the Bible itself is a midrash, may also go to explain some of the ambivalence around Heschel in certain Orthodox worlds over the question of like the content of Revelation and different versions of Revelation. So I think it's a good note to end on, which is that what he tried to do is bring song. He really tried to bring song to us, and to try to move us through the ways in which song can move us. And for those who find it too this, you're going to say, you haven't proven God. You haven't persuaded me because I still don't have a proof. He's going to say, it's in here. Like, open yourself up. You'll feel it. And he's hoping through, all of his writing and talking and engagements and all of his actions to make space and move God down. He's also susceptible to people who don't want to think of God as needing humans. And although, of course, in that formulation, which Heschel does all the time, God in need of man, God in search of man, he knows that language is limiting. So obviously, God doesn't need man in the way that man needs things. God needs man in a way that we don't understand, and yet it's real. So that language itself is obviously, it's an understatement, like all language is for Heschel. All language is an understatement when it comes to God. All language is an understatement. But it's real. And what Shai Held says about that is that Heschel's God chooses to self-limit in much the same ways that the Kabbalistic God chooses to self-limit. And in that, I think people will tend to see Heschel doing a bit of a dance between like his comfort with a self-limited God and his discomfort with it. And by inserting the idea that God's choosing, it's still sort of giving power to God as opposed to seeing it as like an inevitability. Again, scholars greater than I are kind of weighing in on that debate. My sense of it is that that's not exactly the thing that's keeping him up at night. But I do just want to share that other reasons why there may be ambivalence about Heschel in terms of some of his theological assumptions. But at the end of the day, when in that interview with Carl Stern, he said the last question was, the last few minutes, you want to turn to the youth and say something. And so Heschel turns to the youth with his big white beard and his big white hair, and he said, above all, remember that there is meaning beyond absurdity, and make of your life like it's a work of art. Laila Tov.
Thank you so much for this stimulating presentation. Thank you all for coming. We'll see you next week with Roberto Beit and the following week with Dr. Tamara Ross.
Nice. Good lineup. Good lineup. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm a big fan, always